Welcome to our seminar, The Principles of Property Investment. Franklin D. Roosevelt, at that point in time, the President of the United States of America, stated that real estate cannot be lost or stolen, nor can it be carried away. Purchased with common sense, paid in full, and managed with reasonable care, it is about the safest investment in the world. Wise words, and I submit those words are still applicable very much in our environment and economy today. We will deal with the theoretical information first. After that, we will apply all the theory with practical examples. So if we have a look at inflation first. Inflation, especially in the South African housing context, and specifically property investment environment, is an important correlation to the growth of an investment property. And this will become clear as we discuss this. So let's have a look at what inflation is. It is actually quite easy. Inflation is literally a rise in prices. And that can be translated as the decline of purchasing power over time, which means whatever I can purchase at this point in time with 100 Rand will, depending on what the inflation rate is during the next year, perhaps require payment next year at the same time of 106 or 107,000 if the inflation rate is equal to 6 or 7%. Thus, the rate at which the purchasing power of our money would drop shall be reflected in the average price increase of a basket of selected goods and services over a specific period of time. If we talk about the basket of selected goods and services in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, there's a basket used by the South African Reserve Bank of approximately 400 odd goods and services, ranging from basic foods all the way to more expensive items like motor vehicles and the prices of legal services, medical services, etc. So a basket is literally selected, and the increase in prices over a one-year period is determined, and that particular outcome would result in a specific inflation rate. For example, if that particular basket of goods cost today the total sum of 1,000 Rand, on average, all those items added up and divided by the number of items, and the same basket of goods would cost 1,100 Rand next year, 365 days from now. That would, of course, then translate to a 10% inflation rate, simply because the average price of the basket of goods increased over a one-year period with 10%. I hope that makes sense. Now, this rise in prices is very often expressed as a percentage. Mostly it is expressed as a percentage. And it means that your money effectively buys less than what it did 1 year before, prior to today's date. Inflation is the rate at which prices for goods and services rise. And the most commonly used inflation indexes to determine this rate are the consumer price index and the wholesale price index, which is the last one is mostly used in Europe and the United States of America. Now, for people who own tangible assets like land or immovable property, would prefer rising inflation, as the inflation would result in the rise of the value of that particular asset. The next item that we have to look at is, of course, what we refer to as asset classes. Now, when we refer to property or land as an asset class, it should be understood as a segment or part of assets with the same or similar common attributes and are differentiated from other classes by the kind, the type, quality, and or the returns that you can derive from that particular asset. Property includes actual immovable property, but also may refer to interests in real estate investment trusts, or so-called REITs. For example, property as an asset subclass, and residential property as a segment of that particular subclass is differentiated or different from shares, or as we very often refer to it, as equities, which of course represent ownership interest in a company. From an investment perspective, investment classes of businesses are also defined by common risk factors: capital growth, income derived from that particular investment, income growth, in other words, how much would my income that I derive from that particular investment grow annually. And it is also significantly influenced or impacted by very specific or unique tax strategies and the regimes. Now, tax regimes would refer to both the tax type and the marginal rates it attracts versus deductions. In other words, certain expenditure that you are allowed to deduct from your income, rebates, like, for example, rebates available in South Africa on primary interest income, allowances, and deferments. Now, deferments would refer to delaying or the postponement of having to actually pay the tax which had already been assessed. And all of those are, of course, allowed by the fiscus, as we refer to it. Now, fiscus refer generally to the revenue income tax service in South Africa, called the SARS, or South African Revenue Service. And then, of course, the Department of Finance, which is a national government department. Now, immovable property could be divided again into further subclass segments. Now, remember, we refer to property as an asset class, as we've already mentioned, but there are subclasses in this particular asset class. And so we have residential subclasses, being specifically land, property which is used for housing. The second is commercial, being real estate used for business activities, including shopping malls, retail stores, and office space. And then we have industrial land, for example, warehouses and factories, and all of those are designed and used to manufacture or store goods. And then the last subclass that we would refer to is that of agricultural, which simply refers to land which is primarily used for commercial farming activities and would also include subsistence farming. Now, commercial and industrial property investment generally is extremely sensitive to economic conditions. Risk associated with commercial and industrial property investment was harshly highlighted and demonstrated during the national and actually worldwide lockdown brought about and occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the recovery of this particular subclass, commercial and industrial, there is no doubt that the recovery process will be slow and painful. And let me just add this at this point in time. During lockdown, people were prohibited from leaving their homes, going to work, attending their offices, going to the factories, go and work in the factories, that sort of thing, which mean that the factories and the businesses were not operating and producing as they normally would, which of course meant that a tenant of a industrial or a commercial property would have to continue paying the contractual lease or the rental without being in a position to manufacture or produce. Now, it is quite clear from a common sense perspective that it meant you were not allowed to manufacture or produce, but you were, in terms of your lease agreement with the landlord, still liable for payment of your rental or the lease. Now, residential property, as opposed to commercial and industrial, is, of course, as we already mentioned, a subclass or a subsegment category, and residential would then be subdivided in additional investment subclass segments. Let's start with the first one, which is what we would refer to as low-income residential housing. In other words, housing, residences for the occupation and use of individuals and families with a low, below average annual household income. And if we talk about household income, then we talk about the income of every member of the family who lives in that particular unit added together. Low-income housing programs may occasionally be funded and managed privately, but are mostly funded, subsidized, and managed by local authorities or municipalities, provincial and national government, in the form of low-income housing schemes. In the second instance, middle-class housing, being housing specifically designed for and aimed at the middle income group, being families who live together, whose income fall within the middle of the income range of the population. And then, of course, the high-income housing bracket being housing aimed specifically at the high-income group whose income falls within the high-income range of the population. In South Africa, this income range would more or less translate into those people whose tax liability would fall within the 45% marginal tax rate. Now, at this point in time, it would boil down to a person or an individual or a taxpayer who earns above 1,700,000, 1,800,000 rand as from approximately the 1st of March 2023. Now, in developed countries, and to a lesser extent, developing countries, now there is a difference between developed and developing countries. South Africa is, in fact, not a developed country, like, for example, the United States or France or Britain. But South Africa is, in fact, a developing country. Now, in developed and developing countries, the middle class represents by far the bulk of the economically active population. Middle class housing is, as a rule, not subsidized by government, but are indirectly or by extension subsidized by the fiscus through tax measures, tax allowances, tax deductions, etc. In addition, this segment is the likeliest to include a positive income property or positively geared property, which will return a positive cash flow. We will look at this in more detail a little bit later, year and after, but it means if you take your gross income that you derive from this property, in other words, you purchased the property, you procured a tenant, and if you then deduct all your expenses in respect of this property, if you then have money left, then it is, in fact, a property which has a positive income gearing or a positive cash flow, because your income exceeds your expenditure in respect of this property. Now, the middle-class housing segment is by far the largest segment, and higher returns are always driven by higher demand. It means the more people in general want your product, the higher it would push or force the prices that you can achieve. As the reason for it being, of course, that higher demand implies and has the result of higher competition amongst the consumer who actually want that particular product, and which then translates into higher achievable rent. Housing is, after all, about people and their desire to live and congregate in security and harmony. Now, economic psychology dictates high returns from high demand, and inversely, low returns from low demand. Let me use an example. If you have a housing unit in a popular area, which has an exceptionally high demand from the consumer, you would be able to get for that particular unit a higher rental income than what you would in a rural area where there is simply no interest in renting that very same unit. For example, due to a lack of job opportunities and economic activity. Thus, the investor in middle-class housing could earn from the onset an investment income which is more than the cost of owning the property. We call it negative cost of ownership. Cost of ownership is expressed as, and here is the rough calculation. I take my income or my rental that I derive from this property, then I deduct from it the capital reduction and the finance costs. In other words, the two elements of the bond installment from my income. And that is, of course, if the property was not purchased cash, but if you went to the bank, applied for a bond, and purchased the property with the help of the bank against registration of a bond over the property. You also then deduct from that local authority rates and taxes, as we would colloquially very often refer to it as water and lights. And you also deduct the homeowners or the body corporate levies. If it's a sectional title unit, you wouldn't have, in most instances, body corporate levies or homeowners levies if it's a so-called conventional title, in other words, an ERV or a plot or a stand in a neighborhood, as opposed to a flat, as is normally referred to it. Also deduct from it the property management fees or charges, those monies charged by the agent who will find you a tenant if you so require, and then manage the property and the tenant if that is applicable. Firstly, we will now have a look at the calculation of what we call our rate of return, or ROR. An investment is an asset, of course, acquired with the intent of generating income and or appreciation or growth of value of that particular asset over time. Of course, the aim and purpose is not to consume the asset or use it up until there's nothing left, but to derive income and value growth from that particular asset, and the ultimate intention is to create wealth for the owner or the investor. An investment involves the outlay of some capital upon date of acquisition, on the date that you become the owner of that investment. And that particular outlay could be in the form of time that you spend into achieving it, effort that you put into it, or cash, money. But it presumes a greater return over time than what you put into it. And that's an important part of the definition of investment. Rate of return and capital growth, or CG, is calculated on the actual capital which you invest. Now, if you purchase a property for 500,000 Rand and you purchase it cash, it will mean that the money that you invested into it was 500,000 Rand. That is, in fact, your ACI, or actual capital invested. If, however, you purchase that same property for 500,000 and you go to the bank and you ask for a bond for 400,000, the bank lends you the 400,000, and out of your own pocket, from your savings account or your current account, you take 100,000 Rand and you pay the 100,000 as a deposit. Now, the ACI, or actual capital invested, is not 500,000. It is clearly 100,000, because that is the money that leaves your pocket that you actually physically invest. The 400,000 wasn't yours to start with. It belongs to the bank. The bank is lending it to you. What you will do, instead of you repaying the bank, you will find the tenant, allow the tenant to occupy your property, and as far as possible, you will get the tenant, by virtue of the rental that he or she is paying, to pay the installment to the bank. So if the rental income exceeds the installment, then it literally means that your investment remains only 100,000 because the liability to the bank will in fact be paid on your behalf by your friendly neighborhood tenant. Now, cost of ownership, or COO, is a relative term. We're going to have a very brief look at what COO means. When the property is financed with 100% loan, then there would be a significant difference in your COO from when the property is acquired cash. And I've already to a certain extent explained that, but let's have a look at it from a practical perspective. In figure 1, we actually demonstrate the actual cost of ownership, where my rental income is 6,600 Rand per month. And what we have is called a positive cost of ownership. Now, the fact that I have a shortfall here at the bottom does not look like a positive, does it? But cost of ownership means how much is it costing me out of my own pocket to be the owner of this particular investment property. Now, let's have a look at it. Let's say I purchased this property for 684,000. That's also the money that I borrow from the bank. In other words, 100% bond. And I promise the bank to pay it back to the bank with interest over 20 years. In other words, 240 months. And if my interest rate, if you're so lucky, is 7%, then you will find that my installment would be 5,303 Rand and 4 cents. So let's just do that calculation, because that's a basic calculation that we use when we do property investment. There's my rental income, 6,600 per month. My installment, which would include my capital reduction of my bond, and the interest that I'm paying the bank is 5,303.04. And I deducted that from my income. The same with my levy, which I pay to the body corporate for the maintenance of the common property in that particular sectional title scheme, 482.49. The same with municipal charges. And if I have an agent who found the tenant and manages the property and the tenant, and it's, for example, at 8%, calculated on my rental income, then it would translate to 528 Rand per month. And let's say I provide 100 Rand per month towards maintenance of the property. Then, perhaps you can't see it clearly, so I'll just tell you, my cost of ownership is 133 Rand and 53 cents. So in other words, even though it is a shortfall, I have a positive cost of ownership, because the cost that will come out of my pocket to own this property is 133 Rand and 53 cents. So be careful when we talk about positive cost of ownership. Positive means I have a shortfall. Negative cost of ownership would mean I actually have a surplus. In other words, my net number here at the bottom would not be a minus, it would be a plus. It would be a black number, not a red one. Now, if we take this one step further, COO, cost of ownership, in figure 1, which we've discussed now, amounts to 133 Rand 53 per month. Now that translates to 1,602 Rand per month, which is going to come out of my pocket during that first year. And that's then a negative cash flow. Based on the predicted capital growth, which I extrapolate at 6%, in other words, my estimation is I predict that the value of my property will grow at 6% per year. And if I predict, or extrapolate as we call it, the growth in my income at 6% per year, this property will achieve the returns over a 5-year period which I'm going to demonstrate to you now. There we are. So again, by the end of year one, my bond, which started out at 684, I would have paid off a few rand, and it's now sitting at 670,519 rand. That's the end of year one. Now, because I've predicted that my value of my property will grow at 6% per year, you can see it will increase. 670 plus 6% will give me 650, plus 6% will give me 631, plus 6%, 611,508. And if I add another 6% off, so in other words, 611,508 multiplied by 6% plus 611,508, that would give me, that's actually my bond, my apologies. I would reduce my bond in line 1 from 670 at the end of year 1 to 589,995 by the end of year 5. Why? Because slowly but surely I'm paying off a little bit of capital, and it will reduce my bond, which started out at 684. By the end of year 5, effectively 6 years later, I would have reduced that bond to 589,995. Now we actually get to my capital growth is this particular line, purchase price or value. You will remember, I bought the property for 684. So, by the end of year 1, I would have achieved 12 months growth at 6%, which means I multiply 684 by 6%, and I take that result and add 684 to it. So by the end of year 1, my property would have increased to 725,040 rand. So at the end of year 2, I take that amount, multiply it by 6% plus 725. So by the end of year 2, the value of my property would have increased to 768,542, etc., every year, until at the end of year 5, my property would have increased in value from 684 to 915,346. Now, the same would happen to my rental income. If I predict or extrapolate, as we said, that my income or my rental will grow with 6% per year, and that's basically because I did an analysis of rental growth historically in that particular area, and if possible in that particular development, then I would start out in year 1, my rental would be for that particular year 79,200. But if I multiply that by 6% plus 79,200, it means I predict that during year 2 I would derive an income, an increased income from my rental property of 83,952, etc., until during year 5, because of that growth in income, I would earn a rental income for that particular year, year 5, of 99,988. Now, if you look at it, then you'll see it is literally 99,988 less 79,200 in year 1. Now, that translates to an increase over the 5 years of 20,788 rand, the growth over this period. My installments will remain the same on condition that the interest rates remain the same. So for argument's sake here, it means even though my income would grow, my installment would remain the same. But my levy and homeowners would, of course, increase because living cost or inflation would force it up at that estimated 6% per year inflation rate. So it means in year one, I would only pay the body corporate 5,790 in total. But because of the effect of inflation, the body corporate will increase my levy every year. So during year 5, I would actually pay 6,607 Rand as opposed to 5,790 in year one. The same would happen with a municipal cost. Also, inflation in action, it would mean that my rates and taxes charged by the municipality would increase from 3,840 in year 1 to 4,579 in year 5. The same would, of course, happen to my agent's commission, the commission that I pay my agent. Why? Because I pay 8% of my rental income to my agent to find me the tenant, manage the tenant and my property. Therefore, my agent's commission would also increase. The same argument would apply to maintenance. I would have to increase my maintenance provision every year because of inflation. Remember, we said at the beginning, inflation is the driver of the escalation of the value of my investment. Now, my cost of ownership, as I mentioned, in year 1 is a positive COO because I have a shortfall. But that would change as my income increases. And you can see during year 2, I actually make a little bit of profit, which will force me to pay a little bit of tax, etc., from year to year. And during year 5, I would actually make a taxable income under normal circumstances or positive cash flow of 16,178. Now, during year 1, I had a positive COO and negative cash flow, but during year 5, I will have a negative COO or positive cash flow. Now, if you look at this, what I did in effect, because I took 100% bond, I didn't take any money out of my own pocket. So how much did I actually invest from my own pocket into this property? This amount, 1,602 Rand, because that was the only shortfall that I ever had in respect of this property. I didn't pay a deposit, but I had a shortfall during year 1 of 1,602. So it means I literally invested out of my own pocket 1,602. Now, it means I get this capital growth of 20,788 Rand, and that is the growth that I get on the 1,600 that I invested. Now that, if you look at it from that perspective, you can see it's an astronomical return on investment. And I did the numbers, and there's your percentage return during year 1. Now have a look at what your return is. In other words, I invested, literally, use the example of investing 1,602 Rand in the bank. That 1,602 will grow in that bank over that 5-year period to 20,788 Rand. Remember, my income has now grown, but also the value of my property has now grown with approximately, look at that, 915 minus 725, the value at the end of year 1. So from the end of year 1 until the end of year 5, the increase in the value of my property is approximately 190,000 Rand. So my income has grown with about 20,000 over that period. My investment value increased with approximately 190,000 Rand, which means I invested 1,600 Rand to get capital growth of approximately 190,000 and an income growth of approximately 20,000. And if you look at it from that perspective, then you can see it's an astronomical return on investment or rate of return over 4,000. I hope this made sense. I invest 1,600. I get a capital growth on my investment of about 190,000, and my income grow approximately 20,000 Rand per year. Good. Now, cost of ownership, if it's a cash property, and I use the example, if my rental income, now remember, if I can show you again, I took 100% bond to purchase this property. Now, if I don't take a bond at all, and I purchase the 684,000 Rand property cash, the numbers will be the same, except that I will not have an installment that I have to pay the bank, because I had the 684 in my bank account, paid for the property. So during year one, I will literally have, if you look at it from that perspective, 5353.51 surplus per month. Now, if we translate those numbers, in other words, I invested 684 and I will get a return of 5353.51 per month. So if I then do the same as what we did with a bonded property, then it means those numbers remain the same. I will still get that 190,000 Rand growth. My income will, of course, be much larger because I don't have an installment to pay. But again, you can see I get that approximately 22,000 Rand growth in income. So I invested 684 from my own pocket, and I will, during year 5, receive an income on my investment of 103,000. But I will also receive 190,000 Rand growth in the value of my investment. Now, the rest of the numbers are approximately the same, but have a look at the interesting difference if I take the money out of my own pocket and not borrow it from the bank. Look at these numbers. You see how much smaller my actual rate of return is. Why? Because I didn't get anybody else to repay the bank. I am the bank. I have already earned the full purchase price of the property. I've paid the tax on it, and this is what I have left. And I literally take my own money, not the bank's money, and I invest it in this property. Now, let's have a look at this. During year 5, I have an ROR, rate of return of 46%, which is great, but compare it to if I borrow the money from the bank. Look at that. If I borrow the money, all of it, then my rate of return is 4,242.99% because I only invested 1,600. If I take the whole purchase price out of my pocket, I only get 46% ROR, because instead of investing 1,600, I literally invested 684,000 of my own money. I hope that's clear. Now, all of the above, of course, translates into the following summary of what we call the TER return nature of property as an asset class. Now, TER is just the Latin word for 3. In other words, we have a 3-fold return on investment from property as an asset class. First thing is, property investment demands a thorough and unremitting analysis and balance of market segmental risks. For example, where is it situated? The geographical information. The consumer and demographic, in other words, who are the people who live there? Are they extremely poor people? Are they middle income people? Are they people with jobs? Are they male or female, etc., etc.? And of course, that is what we refer to as the demographic characteristics of the human population in that particular area. And there you can see it is made up of the age, the gender, male or female, income, level of income, and that is used to identify the market segment that I will target in that particular area for that particular property. Then we look at socioeconomic considerations in that particular area. Is it low income area, is it middle income area, or is it a high income area? And then ultimately the two primary dimensions of housing affordability, which we measure in price to income, disposable income, and COO. Remember, we spoke about the COO in respect of the investor, and the rent to income in respect of the targeted consumer or tenant. In other words, who is the tenant that I will target for my particular unit? If it's a room in a rural area, which doesn't have its own bathroom, then you can see it differs materially from the luxury penthouse in Sandton. Now, the second one is investment property as an asset class uniquely provides capital protection and appreciation, as well as an annuity income and income growth. And there's the return principle in action. Investment property in the low-income middle-class segment provides a restricted balance between risk, security, capital protection, and appreciation, COO and ROR, the socioeconomic threats negatively impacting on all of those elements. Now, investment property in the middle-income, middle-class segment, which is the one we like, provides a sustainable balance between the calculation of risk, security, capital protection, and the appreciation of value, or the growth in value, as well as the COO and the ROR. Let's just remind you, COO is cost of ownership, and ROR is your rate of return. Lastly, investment property in the high income middle class segment provides a sustainable balance between risk, security, capital protection, and appreciation, though in that particular segment you would expect a higher COO, in other words, a bigger shortfall initially, and then of course a lower rate of return compared of course to the middle income, middle class segment, which is that one which we said we actually prefer. Very well. Now, let's just have a look for interest's sake at the growth, the nominal growth, or the growth in the nominal house prices. And let's go back all the way to 1966. Now, it sounds like a long time. The truth is, 1966 is only 57 years ago. And the bigger picture, a very, very short period. But as you can see from this graph, it started out at very small amounts, but it grew over the years quite dramatically, as you can see, from approximately 1996 onwards, and then drastically from 2002 onwards. But have a look at what happened in 2008, when international property markets collapsed because of the economic catastrophe with housing, related to housing in the United States of America, which of course meant the so-called burst of the housing bubble, as it was called. Now, the fact that the housing market, there are very good reasons why it happened, but it collapsed in the United States, and it spilled over throughout the world, and it literally impacted all the economies throughout the world. And you can see during 2008, when that whole thing collapsed, there was even a tiny decline in housing values. But the very next year, it started picking up again. 2009, have a look at that. And in 2009, after the catastrophe or collapse, there's a significant growth. And as you can see, look at where we are at now. It started from a couple of rand, really small amounts, during 1966, and the nominal house price, the average nominal house price in South Africa, by the end of 2014, was sitting at 1,275,000 rand, 75,530 rand. Yeah, 1,275,530 rand. That's a bit clearer, isn't it? So I'm tempted to say, don't listen to my words. Just watch the facts. Look at the facts. These are the official numbers as published by Absa Bank during approximately 2015, 2016, and repeated after that. Now, if that is not capital growth, I don't know what is. Now, here's another interesting one. And this refers to the quarterly rental growth rate year on year with a moving average trend line. And we start at the first quarter. Now, there are 4 quarters in a year. So in other words, a quarter is a 3-month period. Three months times 4 will give you 12 months. So let's just have a look at the rental growth rate. In other words, how much did my rental income increase with or decline with during a particular period? Now, if we start in 2019, it kept on growing, 3.9% that first quarter, second quarter 3.9%, and then it went up slightly, 4%, and then in quarter 4 of 2019, it came down. But what happened in 2020? COVID, worldwide pandemic. And you will remember on the 26th of March 2020, the President of the Republic of South Africa promulgated emergency measures, and lockdown commenced on the 26th, I believe. And have a look at what the effect had been then. Rental prices actually, or rental values, came down. So year on year, during the first quarter, first 3 months until the end of March 2020, the increase was 3.2% from the previous year. Then it came down to a very small growth of 1.6%. In other words, a year before, there in quarter 2 of 2019, from there until quarter 2 in 2020, the rental prices on average throughout the country only increased with 1.6%. And that growth came down in quarter 3, and then it almost hit rock bottom growth in quarter 4. Now, this was pandemic, this was lockdown, this was crisis, nobody moved. You were fined if you were, you received a fine from policemen and the authorities if you were caught outside. Then in 2021, more or less the same happened, except we started seeing a slight growth again in Q4. Now have a look at what is happening here. Here we are in 2022, and this is unfortunately where it ends. Now, then it started increasing my growth again quite significantly. So in other words, during the month 6 to 9 of 2022, compared with a year before it, in other words, Q3 in 2021, my rental income had escalated, or it increased over that 1 year period already with 2.9%. And this was still in the midst of the pandemic. Now, what I can tell you, and unfortunately this graph doesn't extend all the way, we are at this point in time, again, at rental growth statistics equal to what we had just before COVID struck. So we are back there as far as rental growth is concerned. So what we see here is actually really interesting. Not only did the increase in rental values did not go below the floor. It never went into negative, even though the whole wide world was locked up and locked down. At the worst, it only grew with 0.2%, but we never ever had on average a negative growth. In other words, negative would mean now I receive 6,000 per month. Next year, this time, I can only get for that same property 5,800. That would be a negative growth. We never saw that even during the worst times in lockdown. So let's do a comparison with, for example, the stock markets, because remember, equities or shares, all of them traded on the stock markets. Have a look at the results during that same period. These are the actual values. We refer to it as the index, the stock market index. That is literally the share prices added up and divided by the number of shares, companies, if you so wish. That gives you an index. In other words, what is the average price of those shares if you take all of them together? That's the index. Now have a look at this. They're my values. So what happened during 2020? The bottom fell out of it. And that's actually the value of it. So if you have a look at these numbers, it fell all the way from an average of between 55 and 60,000. And it literally dropped. The bottom fell out of it, as I said, all the way to below 40,000. And that is actually a loss in value, not in income, a loss in the actual value of that particular share. And then, of course, already during, by the end of 2021, early 2022, the values of those shares were approximately on par with what it used to be just immediately before. And you can see there's the problem with the shares, why we said, compared to property, the safety of your investment in shares is just not remotely the same as the safety in property, because you will see a gradual growth in value of that particular property. Let me refresh your memory. Have a look at that. There is always a growth in value. But if you compare it to the stock market, have a look at that. You have this quite dramatic fluctuations. So if you buy at that level, the very next day you've lost your shirt, because your 100,000 rand that you bought in shares is now all of a sudden worth 88,000, or if you bought it 70,000, now it's gone down in value to between approximately 62,500. So you can see there is no safety in those numbers. But if we have a look at the annual sale and listing trend of land, let's just do that comparison again. You will see the average asking price fluctuated slightly even during the starting in 2014 all the way through 2020. There the asking price came down, as you can see, and this is the number of property. So in other words, how many properties did we sell during that year? You can see we sold many more properties, almost 400,000 during 2014, whereas in 2020, at the onset of lockdown, we sold approximately 280,000, roughly 100,000 properties less that we sold in South Africa during 2020 than what we did in 2014. And then you can see 2021 started picking up. And then, of course, 2023 is not done yet, so we're only 2 or 3 months into it. But you can see there's already, it started picking up here from 2020, and the number of units that we sold during 2020 was again approximately 360,000 properties during that year. And the average house price, if you look at that, was throughout this period, 2014 to more or less 2028, you can see the average price was around about 1.5 million. That's the asking price. What it was sold for is the blue line here. See that blue line? Now, so if my asking price is 1.5, what I received on average for all the properties in South Africa that were sold during 2020 was an average price throughout the country, and this is all sales of properties, was just over R1 million, the average selling price. Interesting numbers if you look at it from that perspective and you compare it to the roller coaster that you have with shares. Now, we are going to apply what we've discussed here, and I'm going to use one of the projects which are under construction at the moment. It's called Peacehaven. We're going to use the numbers of Peacehaven just to demonstrate what we're doing here. Very well. We've done the theory, which is always the boring side of it, isn't it? So let's apply it from a practical perspective. This is a project in Kempton Park called Peacehaven. And this is we're going to demonstrate all that theory in practice. This is a middle floor unit, and I'm buying this unit at 733,400. You can see that. Now what happens is my capital growth, after I've done the analysis in that particular area of similar sectional title units, then historically the capital growth, in other words, how much my property would grow with in value over the past 10 years, I've used that, and then extrapolated that or predicted it into the future at 5% growth per year. Now what happens is I project a growth in income of 5% per year Again, that is the historical growth of similar units in that particular area. And then the inflation rate, even though it is quite a bit higher than the 4.5 that I predict here, we have to take into account, again, I predicted into the future over a period of 10 years on average. So we have to average it out. And this is also historically, during the past 10 years, the average, and we've used that average. So over the next 10 years, we can expect an average inflation rate of approximately 4.5%. But what I do here, as you can see here, I go to the bank and I borrow 90% of my purchase price. So from my pocket, from my savings, I take 73,340 Rand and I pay that as a deposit. And now what happens? It means that the purchase price, 733, my bond will be registered for 660,000. Am I right? And I take it over 20 years, 240 months. And at the moment, my interest rate is 10.75%, which the bank will more or less grant me. Now, just for interest sake, over the whole period of 20 years, I will pay the bank 948,208 Rand in interest. But I'm not going to pay it, am I? Because I'm getting a tenant. That's why I'm calling it an investment property. I'm borrowing 90% of the purchase price from the bank. I'm asking my agent to find me a tenant, and I'm getting the tenant, as you can see, to pay the bank. So over the next 20 years, the tenants, all of them over this 20-year period, will pay my bank 948,000 Rand interest. And you can see during year one, my tenant will be my friendly neighborhood tenant, will be so nice to pay the bank 17,000 if my property is registered in my name during December 2023. Because remember, this is under construction, so they're still building it. So the developer will only be able to transfer this property into my name more or less early December 2023. So it's only a short period in the financial year. Remember, my financial year will actually end of February 2024. So what happens now is the following. If I use my expected capital growth, I would take my 733, which is my purchase price that I start out with. I will only pay the developer this amount during December when the property is registered. In other words, I exchange ownership of this property for my 10% money plus the bank's 90% upon registration. So it means by the end of February 2024, my property would have increased in value to 770,000 because I will have capital growth. And remember, here's the catch. I buy it now during March 2023. So behind the scenes, even though this property the construction is not finished yet, inflation will keep on ticking over and it will force values up. So I will have the benefit, even though I will only be the owner of this unit for 3 months by the end of Feb 2024. I would have the benefit of 12 months of capital growth by the end of February 2024. I hope this made sense, because inflation is going to keep going. Prices will keep on rising, even though I'm not even the owner yet. So what will happen? This process will continue. So the property that I purchase now for 733, which I will become the owner of during December, will grow by the end of year 10 during 2032 to 1,194,631 Rand, simply because I get 5% growth in value every single year. Remember that graph? 1964 all the way up. It's exactly that same graph in action. It's exactly that same process. So my rental income, again, based on what is the average in that particular area for those particular kind of housing units, would be approximately 6,550. So for the 3 months that I own this property, this will be what I will earn in respect of this property. Now, of course, during the next year, the second year, this will be 655 plus 6%, 5%, I apologize, income growth multiplied by 12 will give me a gross income for that year, 82,530, etc. It will keep on growing, similar to my value growth, until during the year 2032, I will get a rental income for that particular year of 121,934. You remember that Latin word ter nature of investment? There's the first one, there's the second one. So now what happens? My installments would remain more or less the same on condition that the interest rate does not vary dramatically. We are now in a phase of increasing interest rates. My prediction is that we will perhaps during 2023 see an approximate additional 0.5%. In other words, my 10.75 would perhaps go up maximum to 11.25. We'll do that exercise now in a minute. But in other words, my installments would remain basically the same, except, now have a look at this particular line here. If my interest increases, I'm just going to do that quickly, to 11.25%. Have a look at these numbers. There we go, 86,657. Now have a look at what happens. As my installments would increase, 83,109 there, though my rental would remain the same. So if I undo that 11.25% and take it back to 10.5, have a look at 83,109, 83,109, which is my installment. So if I change it back to 10.75, my 83,109 comes down to 80,413. You see that? So it is literally in total for that 0.5% increase, 3,000 Rand per year difference. And that's why I always maintain that these slight increases in interest rates are completely inconsequential. So what now happens is, as you can see, my levy is predicted to be 640 Rand per month. Now, I will not pay as much during the 3 months that I will own it this year and early next year. But you can see, because of inflation, my levy would increase every year. The same would happen with my municipal charges, which you see there. And then, as I explained previously, my agent's commission that I have to pay the agent would increase from year 2 of 6,571 to year 10, 9,345, simply because my income, have a look at that. My income increased from year 2, 82,530 to 121,934 during year 10. I hope that makes sense. So what is the bottom line here? If I invest 73,340 Rand and I have a shortfall, remember, a positive COO, cost of ownership. So I invest to start out with 73,340. Add to that my loss during year 1 plus my loss during year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I will invest in total 121,930. Now, consider this for a moment. For the measly sum of 121,930, I purchase a property of 733,000 Rand. And by investing 121,930, by the end of the year 2028, my investment would have grown to 982,826 in value. Now, if that's not a brilliant investment, I just don't know what is. Plus, I've increased my income. And during 2029, I will unfortunately have to pay a little bit of tax because I will have a negative COO, in other words, a positive cash flow. Just to remind you, COO is the acronym for cost of ownership. Now have a look at this. Look at what my rate of return is. Already from the go, word go. During year 1, I have a rate of return of 46% on my investment. Same year. So during year 10, I get a rate of return of 60% on my 121,930 that I invested. So these are the realities. Let's just play with the numbers for a moment. If I change my deposit, have a look at this, to 12%. Now remember, I start out with a monthly investment out of my own pocket of 923. So if I change that deposit to 12%, see the difference. Now I pay 88,000 out of my pocket, but my shortfall is reduced to 774. But have a look at this. My rate of return has now come down. Why? Because I'm taking more money out of my own pocket. So the underlying secret with property investment is the more money I take out of my own pocket, the lower my rate of return will be. Let me show you again. I get during year 1 an ROR of 39% if I pay a 12% deposit. If I pay a 10% deposit, in other words, a smaller amount, have a look at that. My 39 comes down to 46%. It is a 7% difference in my ROR, simply because I'm getting the tenant to pay more. So my tenant is literally contributing to my own personal pension scheme, if that makes any sense. Now we're going to do this again. Have a look at the impact year during year 10, because from year on in, it keeps growing rapidly. So if I pay 10% deposit, my ROR is 60%. So if I change it to 12%, Have a look at that. My ROR reduces during year 10 with 2% from 60% to 58%. So even though it is quite significant during year 1, it becomes less expressed and influential during year 10 and further. Now, just for interest's sake, if I do that with 15%, then I pay 110,000 out of my own pocket. And then you can see there's a significant impact on my rate of return. And here it's down to 31%. Look at that 31%. If I make it 10%, it's 46%. It is 15% difference. Now, I've done a slight calculation here with the taxation. Now, have a look at this. You remember we spoke about tax. If I do not have any tax benefits, then this is what it looks like. If I buy in a company where my tax rate is 27%, then I will not pay tax during year 1. I will not pay tax during year 2, but I will start paying tax. There's my tax. I will owe the receiver of revenue 13 Rand by the end of 2025. And it'll go up to 11,000 in tax that I have to pay on this property. But there is a tax regime, and we don't have the time today to deal with that, but there is a particular tax structure that if I own 5 properties in the same name, in the same company, for example, in respect of whom all of them had been new and unused when I bought them, minimum of 5, then the receiver gives me a very special deal. So I'm going to change that to yes. Now have a look at the difference here. Shortfall during year 1, no tax. Year 2, no tax, and then I start paying tax. So if I do that, and I own 5 properties, have a look at the difference. I will not pay tax, and I will only pay tax during 2027. I will, for the first time, pay 423 Rand in tax. Why? Because there is a very specific tax dispensation available, granted by the receiver of revenue. And this will continue for this particular tax dispensation is over a 20-year period. Now, let me do that again. Have a look at my tax liability during year 10. If I have 5 properties which were new and unused when I became the owner, as opposed to not. Instead of having to pay basically 6,000 Rand in tax 10 years from now, I will pay more than double if I don't have that tax structure. Now, that is a significant benefit if you look at it from that. And you will remember when we dealt with the theory, we said your return on investment and your rate of return is definitely influenced by something as apparently unknown as tax dispensations. There's quite a few of these, but this is just to demonstrate in practice the impact of taxation on property. Because you can see, from my income, I'm allowed to deduct the interest that I pay to the bank or that my tenant has been paying to the bank, the levy and the homeowners, which the tenant mostly paid, the same with municipal charges, the agent that I paid the commission. So you can see, at this point in time, I will be able to carry forward for approximately a period of 3 tax years my assessed loss. In other words, I made a loss 30,000 and I can carry it over to my next year. But we're not going to deal with the tax today. We will make available another opportunity for the taxation side. Please just let us know if you're interested in that. because tax is a lengthy subject for which we obviously don't have time. But I wanted to illustrate the practicalities of the theory that we discussed previously a little bit earlier. So that's the reality as far as from a practical perspective. Now, this particular project is ongoing, and this is a lucrative property investment. Again, by way of practical application of the theory, we're going to have, I took a property, a specific actual property, which is currently in the market in, I believe this is Kempton Park. It's an existing property as opposed to the new developments that we discussed in some detail previously. And I'm demonstrating this one in particular because I have a specific point to make. Now, keep in mind when we have a look at the numbers, this property was originally purchased by the current owner during 2016 for an amount of $1,560,000. The actual asking price at the moment is $1,888,950, but this property is actually now available for $1,732,500. The reason for this apparently is that like many people, the current owner is immigrating from South Africa to the United Kingdom, and there was then an indication that the decreased price, approximately 156,000 discount, would be considered by this particular owner. Now we're going to have a look at this, and I'm going to demonstrate a specific point here for you to look at. Okay, here's our analysis of this existing property in Kempton Park. I don't have any other details except just to call it Kempton Park. But remember, I said apparently the owner will now accept $1,732,500. Now, if you have a look at it, it means since 2016, the average capital growth was 3%. Now, the first reaction that I had, yeah, that's not really significant, is it? But when I thought about it for a moment, I realized that this is taking into account 3 years of lockdown and COVID, which means that the average, remember we spoke about the 10-year average previously, which used to be 5% in a particular area. So taking into account the absolutely catastrophic impact on the economy of the 3 years during lockdown, the 3% is actually significant. So let's use the 3% and not the normal one of 5%. Now, in that particular area, historically, the projected income growth is 5.5%. And then I have, just to make it really interesting, made the inflation rate 5.5%, just to see what the numbers do for us. And what I want to demonstrate here is the following. I buy it for $1,732,500. I go to the bank, I borrow $1,559,250. So I give a 10% deposit. There we are. Out of my own pocket, I pay $173,250. And you will see I will have to invest every month in this property $5,679.96. Now, what is interesting about this, I remind you of the definition of investment. It means you either take time, effort, and or money, and you use that towards the procurement of an asset with the expectation that this asset will grow and that it will provide you with an annuity income, which income would also continue to grow every year. So if you invest in a policy and a retirement annuity, and you invest that every month, have a look at what it does if you rather invest it in this particular property. Now, it means I will have a shortfall year 1, year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then basically year 7. So it means if I pay a 10% deposit and I keep on spending a little bit of money on it, by more or less the end of 2029, I will not have a shortfall anymore. But by then, I would have invested 413,741 Rand. Now consider this for a moment. If I pay 413,000 for a 1.7 million Rand property, that's a really nice discount, isn't it? Because this is what will come out of my pocket. This is what I will pay. This is my investment. Now, what I find interesting about this is I wanted to demonstrate one particular point, and it's the following. That if I buy it now, and it's registered during April in my name, and if I sell it by 2029, I would have invested out of my pocket 413,000. But the rest of it would have been paid on my behalf by my tenant or tenants during this period. So I buy it for 1,732. I sell it by the end of 2029 for 2,130,756. There's my capital growth, because that's what the area has taught me and told me I can grow towards. Now, you know what's the interesting thing about this? This is an existing property, which will not give the dramatic escalation that you normally associate with a new and unused. In other words, buying from a developer in a new unit. This will give you that steady growth, which is, as you can see, predicted at an extremely conservative rate, with an extremely liberal inflation rate. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. Have a look at this. My return on my investment by the end of 2029, there is 96.26%. How did I calculate that? Let me show you. I took my selling price at the end of 2029, 2,130. I deduct from that what I paid for the property. It gives me a net capital gain. And then what I do with that result is, as you can see in my formula here, there's my formula. Then I divide my capital gain. 2,130, there's 173, gives me a certain amount, and I divide that by 413,741, which is the amount that I spend on it. And that will give me a return of 96.26%. Now, I'm sorry, but I haven't seen gold or shares or insurance products or any other type of investment that will, as a very conservative investment, over the next, how much is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, am I right? 6 years. That'll give me a return on the money that I invest in it of 96.26%. It's just not done. Now you understand why we say that if I remind you again of that graph, where it started out in 1966 from a couple of rand. Well, back then, it was just at the point in time when South Africa wasn't using pound sterling anymore. It just, at that point in time, went over into the metric system and the rand. So a couple of rand that you paid for a particular property, and then you received when you sold it here in 2014 for, you remember, 1,000,000 for 240 odd rand. So it's that process in action. This is what is demonstrated in practical terms here, where you can, over the next 6 years, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a short, medium-term investment. Get in at 1,732, get out at 2,130, and make 96.26%. It's as simple as that. And there you have it. There's what I found interesting about this particular property. As far as I know, this property is perhaps still available. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and always do. This was a very brief synopsis of property investment, and I realized some of it was really technical, but unfortunately, without that theory, it is difficult to understand the practical application of it. You are more than welcome to get in touch with us. In particular, also, if you want more information regarding the particular property in Kempton Park and the developments which are specifically designed for investors. Should you wish to do so, you're welcome to contact us at info@vanstadeninc.co.za, and the landline telephone number there is 010-023-2478. Thank you so much. I hope you found this to be informative, and thank you for spending the time with us.